Hey,
Hey, calling Chris Anderson in London.
this is Chris Anderson in London, calling Rick Beyer in Chicago.
Well, I'm glad I reached you, Chris, because,
Yes.
those international transatlantic circuits are always a bit dodgy, as you
Well,
like
if
to say, where you are from.
well, if you'd get on top of this whole daylight savings time thing, this wouldn't have been a problem,
We're
would
on
it?
top of it. I don't know if any of our audience will be on top of it. They may, of course, still be looking for us in an hour, but we hope not. Chris, I did the coolest thing as we're waiting for people to join us here on History Happy Hour, which is here every Sunday at 4 p.m. I spoke before a live audience this week.
And what did you speak about,
I
Rick?
spoke about the Ghost Army.
Ghost
Okay?
Army, Ghost
Yes.
Army, Ghost Army.
There you go. So everybody who's joining us, you got your chance to drink. Don't forget about that. And I brought a picture. This was a carefully socially distanced gathering,
Yeah.
and this is a nice picture. We had eight people
Wow.
in the audience. Very
Very
exciting.
good. Yeah.
Who is that old guy in front there?
I don't know.
Because I don't look anything like that, do
He
I?
looks a lot wiser than you.
He's got very gray silver hair. That cannot possibly be me, I don't think. It must be
lighting.
a
It's the
quirk
lighting.
of the lighting or something.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, I want to say, as people are joining us from all over, that it was great, of course, to get out and speak about the Ghost Army. But we've actually, just for anybody who's interested, we've been working to lobby Congress to award this World War II Deception Unit a Congressional Gold Medal, and we now have 220 representatives co-sponsoring this legislation. So that is literally more than half of the House of Representatives now co-sponsors the legislation. We need to get 70 more to bring it to a vote on the floor, and so that's something we're excited about and
Awesome.
moving forward on. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Oh, we got a bunch of people here. Who we
Who we
got?
Oh, we have Tom and Robert, Nancy,
Paul,
Doug, Patrick.
Kevin, a bunch of other people. Doug in Chester, Joe Strauss, Robert in St. Louis. So it's great to have an audience. And if we have an audience, Chris, then what time does that mean it is?
It's time to play that slick intro, Rick.
Ooh, we're just praised by Chris Wallace, I might
There
add.
we go. Thank you.
The bar is
All right,
open. And Chris, what's on tap today?
We have a Camden Pale Ale.
Okay, great. And I am drinking a Boatswain American IPA, but I don't know if you can see this, but I am drinking it in my Royal Dockyards of Bermuda mug. So that
If you say so.
that is in honor of today's guest and topic. Tell us about today's topic and guest.
Well, excellent. Yes, I'm really excited about this. We, as Americans, D-Day is, of course, one of the most important moments of World War II for us. And to us, we like to imagine that Eisenhower gets dropped off on a beach, or his troops get dropped off on a beach in Normandy while some paratroopers land behind the beach. Rangers land at Pointy Hawk. At the end of the day, they're on top of the bluffs. Game over, we win, and we march on to victory. And hooray! But one of the things that I always talk to people about on my tours is that it's a joint operation, and it's very much, if you look at it, I like to say it's probably one of the last great British operations of World War II. More than 5,000 of the ships deployed, half the aircraft, and more than half of the men are either British or under British command. And one of the central characters or personalities of all that is Admiral Bertram Ramsay. He commands, there he is to the left there of Eisenhower. Ramsay is Eisenhower's naval commander, and he's the man that plans the naval component, Operation Neptune. And he's critical, and he's involved in a number of other operations during World War II. But unfortunately, for some reasons that we'll get into, he is not as well known as some of the other great personalities. And so we're fortunate this week to have Brian Izzard, and Brian has written a biography of Admiral Ramsey, and hopefully by the end of this, we'll all have a much better sense of not only his whole war career, but what he did and why his role is so important for D-Day.
And we should mention the name of Brian's book. I know he'll really
Yes.
appreciate it. It's
Yep,
called
I have.
Mastermind
There you go.
of Dunkirk and D-Day.
Yes. So thanks, Brian, for
Brian,
joining
welcome.
it. Yeah, and hopefully,
Well, thank you for having me on the show.
yeah, we're looking forward to having you help educate all the Americans about who Admiral Ramsey was and what he did for D-Day. But just for starters, kind of what brought you to the topic of Admiral Ramsey, and why did you decide that there needed to be a new biography of the Admiral?
Right, well, it came around virtually by accident. I happened to be in Dover, which is a port on the southeast coast of England. And I had it was a sunny day, sunny morning, and I had a few hours to spare. And overlooking Dover is a magnificent castle, which I went to when I was a boy. And I decided that it was time for a return trip. So I went up the cliffs, and when I was in the grounds of Dover Castle, I noticed that there was quite a long queue, or rather line, for the wartime tunnels, which I had not been into before. So I joined the queue, the line, and went on this guided tour. And the tunnels are exactly as they were in wartime. The tunnels had been originally built centuries ago, and they were greatly improved at the beginning of the Second World War. And it was in these tunnels that Ramsey and his team organized the Dunkirk evacuation. So I went on the tour, and towards the end, the guide said, of course, we don't know much about Admiral Ramsey, which I thought was very strange, because he had done this magnificent job in bringing all these British and Allied service personnel to England in the face of this massive German onslaught. So I did some checking and discovered that there had only been one serious biography of Ramsey, and that had been in the 50s, 1950s. So I did some more checking, and of course a lot more has been revealed. A lot more official files are open. So that was my starting point, and I thought, well, time for a new biography.
Well, and you talk about his commanding Dunkirk in those tunnels during World War II, and I know, I think Chris has been to the tunnels. I had never been there, and I can well imagine what that experience must be like to kind of be gobsmacked by history when you have no idea that it's there. So for our audience, tell us a little bit about Ramsey. And I think to me one of the most interesting things is that in a way he almost misses World War II because he gets into kind of a disagreement with a superior officer, and he's forcibly retired from the British Navy before the war ever begins. So give us a little sense of this man and who he is and why he almost misses World War II.
Right. I'll kind of start at the beginning. He was born in 1883, sort of during the late Victorian period. His father was an officer in a British cavalry regiment, and it was decided that when Ramsey was 15, he would become a Royal Navy cadet. So that's where he started his career in the Royal Navy. That's him a bit later as a lieutenant. He was always very smartly turned out. So, and his first sort of serious operation was one of Britain's small wars where there was an amphibious operation in Somaliland in northeast Africa. So that was his first experience of coming in from the sea. And then, of course, he always got excellent reports during his early career, and he was gradually promoted. He served during the First World War. He didn't see a great deal of action, but his career climb was steady, and by 1935 he had achieved one of his ambitions, which was flag rank Rear Admiral. And he had been, early in his career, he'd been friends with another officer called Backhouse, who had sort of climbed up the ladder a bit more quickly. Backhouse had been commander in the Mediterranean, and then he was appointed commander-in-chief of the Home Fleet in Britain, and he needed a flag officer, a chief of staff, and he asked Ramsay. Ramsay thought this would be another rung on the ladder, so he accepted, but pretty quickly things turned sour, and the problem with Admiral Backhouse was that he was a workaholic, and Ramsay was a highly efficient officer, and he would do a lot of the work, look at all the reports, the messages, and only send across those which he thought would be of particular interest to Backhouse, so that the Admiral could carry on doing lots of other things.
And the Admiral didn't like that, right?
No, he didn't, because he was a workaholic.
He wanted to do everything himself.
He wanted to do everything. So after a few weeks, this became agony for actually both of them, because Ramsay wanted to be the efficient chief of staff. Backhouse wanted all this work for himself, as well as doing lots of other things. And so their relationship gradually disintegrated, and it ended up with Ramsay privately likening Admiral Backhouse to Mussolini. Which, of course, he didn't. He didn't say that to his face, but
so he is forcibly retired, and I mean
Ramsay asks for another position, and with very senior officers, most of them, this did not go down very well.
Sure.
Because the feeling was that Ramsay should go all out and do the work, whatever the circumstances. But of course, this was entirely out of Ramsay's character. He wanted to be a good, efficient chief of staff. And to the horror of the senior officers, including the First Sea Lord, the head of the Royal Navy, Ramsay refused to back down and ask for another post. Of course, nothing was forthcoming, and Ramsay was basically left out to dry. And in 1938, I mean, shortly before war commenced, he was told that he was on the retired list. But he was promoted Vice Admiral.
This does give a sense. I'm sorry, Brian, it does really give us a sense, I think. I mean, when I was reading your book, I think of all the things that happened to him, this gives you the strongest sense of the character of this man. He is, I think, what a friend of mine used to call a strong flavor. He's got a. Don't you think that it kind of speaks to his character?
It does. He certainly was not a yes man. So, but in a way, he was quite happy. He had a splendid house in Scotland. He was married. He had 2 children. He loved country pursuits. So he was shuffled off to Scotland, and he was in the wilderness virtually from the time that he left as Backhouse's chief of staff. So he did, in a way, have several years to recharge his batteries. But of course, with war looming, you could not lose someone as important as Ramsay. So he was offered the post of Flag Officer Dover, which is quite an important position because Dover controls the English Channel and France is just across the Channel. So that was his position if war broke out. And ironically enough, the man who offered him this role was Backhouse, who had become the First Sea Lord. But Backhouse, being a workaholic, had to step down as First Sea Lord after only a few months, and he died fairly soon after that.
So, Brian, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So Ramsay was in position in Dover at the start of the Second World War.
So, and now he's in Dover, and you have the period of the Sitzkrieg, and nothing's happening. And then in May, the Panzers head west, and before you know it, the Germans are racing for the coast. Ramsay's in Dover as all this is happening. Is he making preparations before it really gets that bad, or all of a sudden is he just told, oh, by the way, you have to evacuate the BEF? I mean, does he have any sense of kind of what's happening in France? Or
well, as you know, the German offensive happened very quickly and very fast, and there had been this phony war for a long time. I mean, Dover was one of the ports that had been sending over lots of troops and equipment. And of course, the Blitzkrieg happened so quickly in May 1940 that they were not expecting all these troops to suddenly come back. So it was a case of working on a day-to-day basis and getting plans hurriedly formulated.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you know, when this disaster starts to unfold and the decision is made to evacuate the BEF, you know, Churchill says, we have to get them out. Best case scenario, we might be lucky to get about 50,000 men out. But by the time it's all said and done, 300,000 plus. And correct me if I'm wrong, that's all down to Ramsay, really.
It is, yes. I mean, I don't think Churchill was that optimistic. I think he was thinking maybe 40,000 over two or three days.
Right.
But Ramsay was a very focused naval leader, and he had the rights in these tunnels beneath Dover Castle. He had a superb team helping him organise. So instead of the evacuation spanning 2 or 3 days, it went on from May the 26th, 1940 to June the 4th.
Right.
And Brian, I let me flip back here so we can see you. You can see me. I want you to see me too. I read, this is not something that you wrote, so something that I read that I want to kind of throw at you concerning Ramsay. and Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk, that someone had said that that Ramsey, one of the keys to his leadership is that he believed in decentralization and flexibility and giving subordinate commanders a little bit of leeway as opposed to being the guy who wants to draw every string to himself. True, false? What's your point of view on that?
No, I think that's right. Because things were so fast moving that those on the spot, especially Ramsey's, I mean, a lot of there's this great myth about Dunkirk that the little ships sailed off and brought back or, were key. They did play a very important part. But the most important vessels were Ramsey's destroyers and minesweepers and the merchant ships like ferries. And they were the ones that brought back the bulk of the troops from the beaches of Dunkirk and Dunkirk itself.
And he fought, didn't he? He fought to keep those destroyers. At some point, they were going to get taken away. Isn't that right?
That's right, yes. The first Sea Lord at that time was Admiral Pound, and the destroyers were taking heavy losses. Six destroyers were sunk, and lots of others were heavily damaged. And the first Sea Lord, Pound, decided that he could not risk his newer destroyers being lost in the Dunkirk evacuation, because Britain was under threat from Germany with a possible invasion. So he needed as many ships as possible for the defence of Britain. Ramsey was not happy about losing his newer destroyers because he was left with First World War veterans, which were smaller, slower, could not take as many troops. So he went back to Pound and said, look, I need these destroyers because we cannot carry on with the evacuation at this pace unless we have them. So here was a fairly junior flag officer who was supposed to be retired, telling the First Sea Lord, I've got to have these ships back. And Pound relented. So Ramsey got his destroyers back and carried on with the evacuation.
Wow.
Was there anything kind of in his personality or his plan that made the evacuation more successful than everybody thought it would be? I mean, really, when you look at it, it's remarkable that it succeeded as well. And is it kind of his force of personality, his plan? How did he pull it off?
Well, he was a very efficient person. He had very good people in the tunnels beneath Dover Castle, but he also had some very good officers on the ground in Dunkirk. So they understood what was needed and helped to speed up the evacuation.
Now, at the end of it, when you've gotten the people off, so is at that point is Ramsey's stock in the Navy kind of higher than it was before? Or all the other admirals like, wow, this guy's good? Or does he just kind of sit at Dover and the war moves on elsewhere? I mean, what's happening to him after the evacuation?
He impressed a lot of people. And I mean, he was, after the evacuation, he was regarded as the saviour of Dunkirk.
Right.
And rightly so. And he was knighted.
That sends a message, right?
And of course he got a lot of letters of congratulation.
I saw.
But he wasn't promoted, and he was still actually on the retired list.
I want to bring in a couple of our audience questions here, and I'll start. I have to say, Marcus had his question in 3 minutes before we even started the show, so we have to give him credit for being first, and it's probably a pretty straightforward question. He wants to know what you thought of Christopher Nolan's movie, Dunkirk, if, of course, you saw it.
I did see it. I thought it was good, but I thought it did have limitations because he just didn't have the ships that were available to Ramsey, like all of the destroyers. And I think the film only featured one destroyer, and that was French. And that's
that's a fail.
That's a museum ship off the west coast of France at Nantes, which I've actually been on. But I don't think it's of the, I could be wrong, but I don't think it's of the period. Right. But if you actually go to Dunkirk, you will see a lot of modern buildings along the seafront. And if you look closely at the film, you will see those same buildings. And in reality, during the evacuation, Dunkirk port and the town itself were virtually flattened by the Luftwaffe. So the film did not show the massive destruction on the ground.
Well,
all credit to the director, because he didn't want to use all these modern techniques to recreate images which didn't exist. So he tried to make the film as authentic as possible.
I had a couple. I have to interrupt the show now to give my beefs on Christopher Nolan's movie, which I have some serious issues with. First of all, it's very underpopulated, right? I mean, we're talking about, it's hard, but there's 300,000 people evacuated, and it felt like there were about 100 people in the film. But secondly, my biggest problem is that he has a character in there that every action that this character takes is based on a real person, Charles Lightoller, who was the first officer on the Titanic, but then who, operating his own yacht, rescued a bunch of people. And he doesn't ever, not in the film, not in any interview he ever did, does he say, "Oh yes, and this is an homage to Lightoller, and that has damned Christopher Nolan for me for all eternity."
It's a kind of a sensitive topic for you.
You think? Yeah, I'm a little upset. I'm gonna have to go calm down for a while.
Yeah, I mean, Lightoller was one of the few motor yachts owners who actually went across to Dunkirk, and his boat actually was licensed to carry something like 25 or 30 people, and in one trip he brought back something like 130, which was quite remarkable.
He's lucky he didn't get fined. I'm sorry, you've exceeded capacity, Lightoller. It's a problem. And
well, he did ask if he could go back, and he was apparently told, no, it's okay. They're probably worried if he's going to bring too many people back.
Or if he'd hit an iceberg on the way back. I don't know. I could bring in a second question, Chris, and then why don't I do that, and then I'll... so I have absolutely no idea what you're going to think of this, but I'll throw it on here. In Mr. Izzard's research, did he come across what Ramsey thought about returning the treaty ports to the Irish Free State in 1938? And, well, you either did or you didn't come across something, so you can let us know that.
No, I didn't. No.
Okay.
That's the short answer.
Well, it's a great way to deal with a question, is to give that short answer and move on. Mr. Anderson, over to you.
Well, one of the things I'd like you to elaborate on, Brian. So we've successfully evacuated the troops from Dunkirk. His stock has gone up considerably. He's basically saved the British Army. But the war moves on, and you have the Battle of the Atlantic starting to play out, which, arguably by some is the most significant battle of World War II. What is Ramsey doing? Does he have a part to play in the Battle of the Atlantic? Is he involved in other things? What's he up to while all of that is kind of playing itself out?
Well, after the evacuation of Dunkirk, there was a great fear that the Germans would invade Britain.
Right.
So Ramsey was focused on that for several months, possible invasion of Britain. But as it turned out, Operation Sea Lion, which would have been the invasion, was poorly conceived. And as Ramsey showed later, you have to put a lot of work into an amphibious operation. And the Germans didn't, for example, have proper landing craft. They went along all the ports along northern France, Holland, Belgium, collecting barges, which they were going to send over to Britain, which of course were not great. And the RAF were targeting the ports where these barges were assembled. And also, as you know, the Germans never won control of the air or the sea. But that was Ramsey's focus after Dunkirk. And of course, he had the English Channel to protect.
Right.
And you mentioned the Battle of the Atlantic. One thing he did was have patrols to try and stop German U-boats slipping through the channel into the Atlantic. And his measures were so effective that the Germans had to go all around the British coast, round Scotland,
Wow.
and back into the Atlantic, which of course reduced their operational time.
Well, yeah, I could argue that would be another one of his kind of great achievements then, because that's a significant factor in Allied success.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure we spend a little time on D-Day, and to do that we have to skip over a little bit two important things that he was involved in: the invasion of North Africa, where he was, I think, the deputy naval commander, and then the invasion of Sicily, where he is the commander of the British task force. So he is becoming the war's premier British naval landing expert, and possibly the world naval landing expert at this point. And he goes to, he eventually is assigned to be the commander of Operation Neptune, which is the naval component of D-Day. And we have, I will bring in here, because both Chris and I and a bunch of people who are in our audience have been to the map room at his headquarters at Suffolk House there in Portsmouth. And if you've been on a Ghost Army tour, feel free to drink. You've been on you've been to the map room, and of course, in the room next to the map room is the room where Eisenhower, seen here, makes his.
Ike's put on a bit of weight.
Yeah, yes, he's out of uniform. Makes his, of course, incredibly important no-go decision for D-Day. But I mean, this is a huge operation. I mean, this is I think the scale of this would just shock people. Talk to us a little bit about Ramsey's role and kind of what he gets going here with Operation Neptune.
Well, as you say, he did learn a lot from the two previous operations: the invasion of North Africa and the invasion of Sicily. And those amphibious operations worked quite well. I mean, he lost very few ships. What he did learn in particular was the importance of training for people crewing landing craft. So Operation Neptune was an extension of these two other operations, but on a much faster scale. I mean, we're talking about assembling something like 6,000 vessels of all types, battleships, cruisers. I mean, there you see some of the landing craft, ships and vessels of all types. So he had this immense task. But there again, he had a lot of staff officers helping with the planning.
So is there... Are you...
I was muted, but you were so nice to stop anyway. Can I do a quick follow on that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because you said something that has come up time and time in our conversations. When we have talked about General Eisenhower, when we have talked about Dick Winters, who is the commander of the Band of Brothers, the paratroop company, airborne company, which is preparation and training. And it's not the most glamorous thing, but it ends up maybe being one of the biggest determinants of success or failure in operations like this.
Ramsey placed great emphasis on training, and as I mentioned, the landing craft in particular, and it certainly paid off. But one of the great bonuses, as it were, was the strategic surprise which Ramsey was able to achieve. I know that various things went on to deceive the Germans, but even Ramsey on June 6th was surprised at how surprised the Germans were taken, apart from Omaha Beach. And it worked. The operation worked. Neptune worked beyond his expectations.
Well, so one of the things that I was curious about, Brian, and I'll tie this in with a question from Doug. Ramsey, correct me if I'm wrong, but his background is in signals, and then he has a variety of appointments in the Navy. He's retired. He gets the Dover Command, does the evacuation at Dunkirk, but he doesn't have a background in amphibious landings and amphibious operations. So is this a skill that he's... is he interested in it, or does he kind of acquire it on the job? And how does he become kind of the quintessential amphibious landing expert? And then following on from that, just as a side note, Doug was kind of curious, and this kind of goes along with the training question, if he was involved in Operation Tiger and the Slapton Sands thing.
Slapton Sands.
Yeah.
He wasn't directly involved, but he was there as an onlooker.
Okay.
So, and of course, that was a tragedy which he obviously thought of.
And we should
probably when it came to the big day.
We should probably just mention for people in our audience who don't know that Slapton Sands is a training exercise in which German E-boats sunk one or two landing ships, and what were the losses of...
Well, I don't know the exact number, but more Americans were killed during that training operation than were killed on Utah Beach.
Yeah, I mean, it's over 1,000, I think,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I'm sure
I think the official figure was around 700.
Okay.
But they kept it quiet, and the real number was much higher.
Yeah. So, but Brian, how do you think it is that Ramsey became kind of the Britain's expert on amphibious operations? I mean,
I did mention that early in his career as a lieutenant, he charged up a beach in the Somaliland campaign of 1904, which gave him, in a way, an early start. I'm not saying it gave him the big picture, but
did you throw that around a lot? Well, when I charged the beach back in 1904...
Well, actually, he did charge. He was carrying a revolver and a cutlass.
There we go.
But he noticed that the sailors behind him were not so enthusiastic, and he had to check his progress. But that was his first little experience. You mentioned that he specialised in signals, that's true. But he was also interested in the big picture of ship movement.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the way fleets are manoeuvred and so on.
Right.
So I think that he did do a lot of work studying that. And I think that reflected in the way he dealt with these operations, you know, Husky and Neptune itself.
One of the things that was interesting reading your book, and I should remind everybody that we're talking to Brian. Brian, I have been saying your last name, but I don't actually know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Is it Izzard? Izzard? Izzard. Okay, so penalty to Rick and Chris, mostly to Rick for getting that wrong. But was that he was angry and fuming to someone, I don't remember who it was, about the fact that he felt that it was important when he was a younger officer for younger officers to know about tactics and things, and he was angry at the admirals who didn't think anybody should even bother themselves with those thoughts until they got to flag rank. And he says, well, how are you ever going to learn anything if you're not thinking about it before you get to flag rank? So he was always preparing for that.
He was quite outspoken in his early career, but he was also very hardworking. He still got excellent reports, but they did notice that he was rather. They did notice that he was rather outspoken and could have been a lot more tactful. I mean, he fell out with a couple of admirals during the First World War, but that might have slowed his progress up the ranks. But he was still recognised as a budding great officer.
There is a saying, I think, Chris, you can help me with this. I think it's attributed to Admiral King, the American Navy commander during World War II. When the going gets tough, they send for the sons of bitches. And I don't know if that quite fits Admiral Ramsey, but it does seem to me that there is a pattern. There are officers, maybe Ramsey, King, Patton, who are, in peacetime, they are sort of like, oh my God, I don't know how to deal with them. And then in wartime, it's like, hello, Mr. Atkins, come on over and let's be part of the operation, because they're so dynamic that they're almost too big for the peacetime military, but they're exactly who you need in wartime.
Yeah, I think Ramsey was a bit more subtle than Admiral King.
Most people are
that
more
would
subtle.
not be hard.
Admiral Cunningham, who had this great reputation in the Mediterranean, British admiral, he was sent over to Washington during the Second World War, and he had direct dealings with Admiral King, and he actually complained about King's rudeness and felt necessary to correct him. So Cunningham and Ramsey were no shrinking violets when it came to dealing with difficult, high-ranking officers.
So Brian, one of the things that I think I'd be kind of be helpful for our guests to know is how does Ramsey get the command? Is he appointed by Eisenhower or is he appointed by Churchill? How does he kind of get the tap of you're now in charge of Neptune?
He was originally chosen to lead the naval side in the invasion of North Africa.
Right.
But Admiral Cunningham, who had been in Washington, was not a desk warrior and wanted something more high profile on the, as it were, on the battlefield.
Yeah.
So Ramsey was originally chosen, but then he became Cunningham's deputy. And he was also Cunningham's deputy for the invasion of Sicily. But later on, after the success of Sicily, Cunningham became the first Sea Lord, the Royal Navy head. And when it came to choosing somebody to lead Neptune, he decided that there was only one person, and that was Ramsay. Cunningham went to Churchill and said, my choice, the only candidate, is Ramsay. Churchill went to Roosevelt, Ramsay, and they all agreed. So that's how Ramsay came to lead Neptune.
We have a question from our audience that kind of relates to this, so I'll bring this in from Patrick. Patrick, that's 2 questions today, so I mean, who knows when we'll ever call on you again. But can you speak to, one, his relationship with Churchill before D-Day, which you have a little bit there, and 2, how he dealt with Churchill wanting to be on the HMS Belfast on D-Day, because, of course, very famously, both Churchill and initially as well King George wanted to be there for the D-Day invasion, and of course that would mean that Ramsay would have to agree to that. So his relationship with Churchill before D-Day and how he dealt with that situation.
Right, 2 questions. Ramsay got on well with Churchill. Churchill in his early career was a junior army officer, and he was actually in Ramsay's father's regiment, the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, and he was...
Now I know how to pronounce that word too.
And Ramsay was in command in India, and his junior officer was Churchill. And Churchill wrote to his mother on one occasion saying, I get on very well with Colonel Ramsay because he listens to what I have to say. So Churchill knew about Ramsay Jr. from an early age, and I think he actually saw him on when he was on a parade ground in Aldershot, which is one of the military bases in England. And he went to Dover Castle on several occasions to check on the progress of Ramsay's involvement with the war and so on, and they got on well. They were both blunt-speaking characters. And right, the second part of the question. Churchill was very keen to see the D-Day invasion at first hand because he had a lot of experience of conflict, and he liked to be at the center of operations. And Ramsay encountered him one day in the cabinet office unexpectedly, and Churchill was saying, I want to go over with the invasion fleet. And Ramsay had quite a job telling him, and also Cunningham, telling him that he was far too valuable to risk going over on D-Day. And of course, King George VI, who had a long tradition of involvement with the Royal Navy, he was an admiral of the fleet, also wanted to go over. And Cunningham and Ramsay, in their most tactful way, had to say, well, we can't do this because we can't take the risk. But Churchill did, after a few days, go across. And that was a problem Ramsay had. After a few days, D-Day plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, he got a lot of requests from VIPs to sail across and see what was going on the beaches of northern France. And he did find that rather tiresome.
Tourists.
Yeah, but Churchill and King George VI actually got over. But it was certainly a success from day one, because Ramsay, as one of your pictures has shown, Ramsay on June the 7th was able to sail across with Eisenhower and Montgomery in comparative safety. That's on the British warship.
And Chris, can I jump in with? I know I'm jumping the gun.
You do that all.
You can talk to me about it afterwards.
Okay.
But it's interesting because if you look at this picture, so here he is with Montgomery and Ramsey, and there's two things I noted in your book. First of all, Ramsey had no problem speaking to Montgomery in an extremely blunt and straightforward style and saying, here's how it needs to be done. And Montgomery seemed to have relatively little problem with this. I mean, he seemed to really get along with Ramsey. And the other thing that was interesting, I'll just throw these together, is that Ramsey had great respect for Eisenhower and American generals, not as military figures, but as political. He said the Americans are very politically minded, which on such an occasion, talking about the Darwin deal in North Africa to put a Nazi sympathizing figure in charge, which on such an occasion has an advantage from the purely military point of view. Our generals are superior. So I guess I throw these together just to say I found his relationship with these other generals, with these other high-ranking officers, to be really interesting.
Yeah. No, he got on very well with Montgomery. I mean, they were totally different characters. I mean, Montgomery was the flamboyant general who loved publicity. He liked being with his men, making speeches, encouraging them. Ramsey was more reticent. And I think the contrast in their characters, they got on very well together. But Ramsey also had the measure of Montgomery, because Montgomery sometimes saw himself as the supreme leader.
Yeah.
And Montgomery and Ramsey were virtually the same rank. And Ramsey once or twice had to correct him and put him in his place. But Montgomery took it in a fairly humorous way. He wasn't. He didn't hold it against Ramsey.
Well, I came across there's that wonderful story of they're going to a meeting, and Montgomery's staff has laid out the place cards that lists, Ramsey as naval C&C, and I think it was Lee Mallory as air C&C, and then him as just C&C. So before he enters the room, Ramsey and Lee Mallory rearranged the cards so that they're all sitting together. Montgomery comes out and sees that they've rearranged the seating plan, and he just doesn't say anything, but just kind of sits down. And I guess that was Ramsey's way of saying, no, we're all equal here, Monty.
Ramsey certainly made it clear that Montgomery was not the supreme commander.
Right.
And I think Montgomery got the message pretty clearly. You mentioned Eisenhower. Ramsey got on very well with Eisenhower as well. Yeah. And they had a kind of similar background because before the Second World War broke out, I mean, Ramsey was retired, up in Scotland, out of the picture. But Eisenhower was also, he wasn't a high-ranking officer, and I think he was something like a lieutenant colonel in the Philippines. But he had a very strong backer in General Marshall. So the both of them seem to have come from nowhere and suddenly became very prominent figures.
So Brian, one of the things I kind of like to get your thoughts on is when we were doing tours, we go to Southwick House, which, again, as Rick had pointed out, that's actually Admiral Ramsey's headquarters. It's not Eisenhower's headquarters. But there's that room where they're all in when they have to make the final decision to launch the invasion. And Eisenhower's gotten Stagg's report, and he has to decide, and there's a storm outside, and they've just an incredibly emotional moment. What is Ramsey's part in that whole scenario, and what is he saying to Eisenhower as Eisenhower is trying to decide, well, do I go, do I not go, what do I do?
Well, they met on June the 4th, because D-Day was supposed to be June the 5th. And they got these terrible weather reports. So Eisenhower was with Montgomery, all the other chiefs, and was saying, shall we go or shall we stay, virtually. Montgomery was, typical Montgomery, he was all for going. But Ramsey made it clear that because they had organised virtually a daylight invasion, then it was very important to have the proper air support and the naval support. And of course, the weather was so atrocious that they couldn't get the planes in the air to bombard the German positions. So that Ramsey certainly had misgivings about going on June the 5th. And of course, then it was postponed. And it still looked bleak. And then they suddenly got this weather report, which gave them a window. And then it was decided that Eisenhower in the end took the big decision not to actually go ahead with the invasion.
So we're nearing the end of our hour. It's gone very fast. There's a reason that we may not know Admiral Ramsey. There's a reason that he did not write his memoirs, and because his life was cut short. So tell us a little bit about the ending of our story.
Right. It's very poignant because Ramsey had done all this work to bring about the ultimate victory. On January the 2nd, 1945, he decided to have a meeting with Montgomery, who was in Brussels. And Ramsey was based in northern France, and he decided to fly to Brussels. So on June the 2nd, he went to an airfield near his headquarters, boarded a Hudson plane with his own personal pilot. The plane taxied down the runway, barely got off the ground at the end of the runway, climbed a little, banked to port, and then nosedived, and all aboard Ramsey were killed.
Yeah, it's a...
So within months of the ultimate victory, Ramsey, it was something that Ramsey never saw.
So, and that was January 2nd, 1945, I think. And so he did not make it to the end of the war, but his contribution is something that you've done a great job in helping everybody remember 75 years later. So we want to thank you, Brian Izzard, for joining us today on History Happy Hour. And Brian is the author of Mastermind of Dunkirk and D-Day, The Vision of Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay. And Brian, thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Brian.
All right, take care.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
So, Chris, a connected story to this or connected history happened here to this is something that you've got to tell us about. Here not being Chicago, because very few parts of this story actually relate to Chicago. Okay. There are some, but very few.
No, none of them.
Yes, but we'll get there. But go ahead, give us a
this is more kind of a news or current event story. For those of you who've traveled with me to London before, I very often take people to Grosvenor Square, which is where the U.S. Embassy was. Grosvenor Square also has the Roosevelt Monument, the Eagle Squadron Monument, and this building here, which for, I don't know, the past 6 or 7 years has been under scaffolding and tarpaulin, so you couldn't see it. But this building here was Eisenhower's headquarters in London. So he would have obviously had lots of meetings related to D-Day here, and the scaffolding has finally come down. So if you actually make it back to London someday, his office is all the way on the left-hand side, and on what we would call here the first floor, you would call the second.
Because we don't have zeroth floors here.
Zeroth floor.
Zeroth. Hello, I'm going to
But
the
anyway,
office
so
of the zeroth floor.
You can finally see it again. So when I point now, if I actually have a crowd again, I can say that was Eisenhower's office. And
Do you know the officers who created the Ghost Army have an office just across the street? I know, I'm almost empty. Yeah, there you go. So next week on History Happy Hour, we're still going to be happy. Yep. And we have as our guest Kroaski Salter. And Kroaski is he's actually the executive director of the 1st Division Museum here in the Chicago area, but he was the curator of a fantastic exhibit at the Smithsonian about African American soldiers in World War I. And so that is going to be our topic next week, and we hope that everyone will join us again, and that we'll have another deep dive into history. And so thank you for being here today, everybody who joined us. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, guys. Everybody be safe and make sure you vote.
Do vote. If you haven't, do so. Thank you.